From culture vulture to country singer, it's Post Malone. Welcome to 6 Notes of Separation. If you're new to the podcast, here's how it's going to work. Every episode, I'm going to be diving into an artist, exploring their lives, their path to success, and any scandals they might have found themselves tangled up in. But to keep things enticing and intriguing for you all, I've put my own little spin on things. Every episode I do has to be linked to the previous and succeeding artist in some way. This could be through a producer in common. This could be through a potential relationship or friendship of some kind. This could be through references and song lyrics. Truly anything goes as long as there's a link. So, without further ado, I'm going to be jumping into the 18-time Grammy-nominated, genre-defying musician who's gone through the taxing repercussions of being in the public eye and has come out the other side. Of course, it's Post Malone. If you're watching on YouTube, welcome to the festivities. We're halfway through December. You know, Merry Christmas. We're getting festive. But to go back to the podcast, as with every episode, before I take you to the start of Post Malone's career, it's time to quickly reveal the link between this episode and last episode's Morgan Wallen. Unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure most of you would have figured out this link pretty quickly. In May this year, Post Malone released his first single off his newly announced country album, F to 1 Trillion. The single was called I Had Some Help, and it featured none other than Morgan Wallen. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and had the highest weekly sales and streams for a song in 2024. And this is like an insane stat, it came out to be Spotify's top male collaboration of all time. So if you haven't heard of this song, I'd be a little bit concerned because it was absolutely everywhere and it was massive. And if you've just found out now, then that would be the link between Morgan Wallen and Post Malone. I hope you all enjoyed. Now, if you listened to last episode, you have all the context for why Morgan Wallen has become as huge as he is. But if you're wondering how Post Malone came to be as famous, if not even more famous, then look no further, for I shall rewind things to 1995 in New York. This is where Austin Post was born. Austin was introduced to music from a very young age through his father, who had been a DJ when he was younger. This kind of meant he was exposed to genres such as hip-hop and electronic music. And when the Post family moved to Texas 9 years later, it subsequently saw Post Malone, or Austin Post, if you will, growing up with country music also being an impact and an influence around him, which is going to make a lot of sense when we look at the trajectory of his career. A bit roguely, what got Austin into picking up his first guitar was his love for the video game Guitar Hero. I mean, better late than never. And the video game then actually led him to playing around in the digital audio software FL Studio. For anyone who's like, what did I just say? It's basically like your GarageBand or your Logic Pro, but FL Studio focuses more on electronic beats and hip-hop, I want to say, which obviously plays a massive part in the genre of music he turns out to be really, really successful in. His early adventures into music came through the genres of heavy metal and rock. In 2010, he auditioned for an American rock band called Crown the Empire, who now have 600k monthly listeners on Spotify. So, you know, they're not like flying in the same way Post Malone is, but they're definitely established musicians and an established band. However, during the audition process for this band, Post Malone's guitar sadly broke. One of his guitar strings broke, and he did not end up getting a place as a guitarist for Crown the Empire. But to be honest, in hindsight, we can see that that was probably a blessing in disguise, because Post Malone going solo was probably one of the best decisions he could have ever made. Going back to him being about 15 years old, transitioning from heavy metal to hip-hop, thanks to FL Studio, as I just mentioned, you know, specialising in electronic and hip-hop beats, Austin Post, as we once knew him, is replaced with the name Post Malone. The stage name, hilariously, really has no significance other than Post Malone just put his name in a rap generator and it came up with Post Malone, and he saw it, liked it first try, stuck with it ever since. You know, quite like that. He's not a fickle man, and we appreciate that. But interestingly, this wasn't the first or last time Austin went under an alias. In 2012, age 17, Austin Post made a song for a school project titled Why Don't You Love Me, going by the name Leon DiCino. I wish I could tell you why Leon DiCino was the name he picked. You know, I did do some research into what was the meaning behind it, but I couldn't really find much, so maybe that's a fault of my research, or just because what I think is that it was just random. Post Malone just put Leon DiCino and thought, why not? However, he does actually reference the name later on in his career with his song Psycho, which features on his 2018 album Beer Bongs and Bentleys. Anyway, back to his school days. He wrote his first mixtape when he was 16 years old and was voted best dressed as well as most likely to be famous by his classmates in 2013 when he was just 18 years old. And you know what? Those classmates really predicted the future. They really saw the star quality in him, because Post Malone did indeed become very, very famous. After dropping out of uni and moving to LA with his successful gamer friend Jason Probst, who's better known as Minecraft Universe, he's a very, very successful streamer, obviously made money from Minecraft. Post Malone started what would be his career in music. LA being LA meant Post Malone made connections really, really quickly, and he was introduced to a production duo called FKI, but ultimately met a guy called Rex Kudo, who went on to be the producer behind Post Malone's debut single and first hit, White Iverson. White Iverson originally was uploaded to SoundCloud in February of 2015. You know, Post would have uploaded this thinking it might get a couple thousand streams, if that. But it took off. It went viral, to say the least. He released a music video for it in July, which ended up racking up millions and millions of streams. It now has over 1.1 billion streams. But at the time, it also received praise from acclaimed rappers Mac Miller and Wiz Khalifa. So really, with the praise of esteemed musicians and with the praise of the internet, White Iverson launched Post Malone into the spotlight within the music industry. In August of 2015, he got his first record contract, signing with Republic Records, which is a branch within Universal Music Group, you know, one of the biggest labels out there. And he somehow landed himself a spot performing at Kylie Jenner's 18th birthday party. Again, tried to research how this happened, but nothing really, you know, the internet didn't give me anything. He just somehow spawned there, performed there, and ended up meeting Kanye West. Obviously, Kim Kardashian, Kanye West, you know the links. And this led him to one of his first mainstream collaborations. He worked with Kanye on his song Fade, with Post Malone singing some vocals and writing some of the verses. But his part in collaborations only grew from there. He rapped his own verse on rap legend 50 Cent's song Tryna Fuck Me Over, and the celebrity crossovers of 2015 continued. Post Malone also met Justin Bieber through a producer they had in common, and after a beer chug and a share of a cigarette, how romantic, they struck up quite the cordial friendship. Justin, so sweetly, invited him to open for his Purpose World Tour in 2016, which obviously launched Post Malone even further into mainstream media, if you will. You know, Justin Bieber, I'd say, was probably at his peak in 2016. You had girls chasing after the man like he was Harry Styles. So Post Malone opening for him was a huge, huge, huge opportunity. At the end of the year, 6 months later than planned, Post's debut album Stoney dropped, and only a year after that, it was certified as a double platinum selling album. The speed and magnitude of that success, I really can't stress enough. That's huge. A double platinum album is massive, and to achieve that in under a year, even more incredible. And for a debut album, at this point, I'm at a loss for words. His song Congratulations landed him his first top 10 song on the Billboard Hot 100, and so his career seemed to be going in all the right directions. But the fame and attraction Post Malone was subject to really sadly began to get to him and began to destabilise him. The internet started attacking the rapper, labelling him as a culture vulture, which I mentioned in the intro, basically insinuating that not only was he misappropriating the African American culture through his music and the way he dressed, but he was also only using hip-hop, quote-unquote, to make a profit. You know, people believed it wasn't actually a genre of music he was number one interested in or number one appreciated or cared for. He was purely just doing it because it was popular at the time and because it made him money. These accusations ended up making Post Malone have a really difficult relationship with the hip hop scene. You know, rapper Lil B tweeted, Post Malone is slowly turning into a white dude. He's pushing it. Give it a few years and he's going to be full country. Now, this is such an interesting statement. Like, if I read that at the time, I would have just been like, you're a hater. But seeing it now, it's kind of, I don't know if it's humorous or remarkable that Lil B, again, predicted the future. Like, flash forward to 2024 and Post Malone has gone full country with his After 1 Trillion album. But I think there are two ways of looking at this here. The first is that Post Malone is a bit of a Drake. You know, if you're not aware of the rap beef between Kendrick and Drake, Kendrick puts it very well, but he basically accuses Drake of faking a lot of cultures and faking a lot of, I guess maybe personalities or identities in order to be fluid in the music scene. You know, Drake will go from hip hop to pop very, very quickly. And it has a lot of musicians and a lot of people in the rap and hip hop scene angered because, you know, to put it plainly, sometimes Drake acts black, as people say, and sometimes he acts white based on who he's collaborating with and what kind of genre he's performing in. And I guess in a very similar way, this is what Post Malone was being accused of. The whole culture vulture thing, people believed he was faking a kind of, he was trying to put on this African American accent and vibe and copying their culture purely so he could be successful in the hip hop scene. But I think there's also a second way of looking at things, which is how I feel is probably what Post Malone wanted to achieve, which is that Post Malone is just a genre-defying musician who writes in the style he's surrounded by or writes accordingly to the period of his life. I shouldn't have to feel like I need to make a disclaimer, but I think I will quickly just say that maybe at the time when all of this was blowing up, which was around kind of 2017 to 2019, before Post had ventured into other genres, maybe it would have been easy to see him as a culture vulture. But I think in hindsight, for me, it just looks like Post Malone was making the music he wanted to make based on where he was in his life. Like, for example, with FL Studio, and that being his I guess, into his inspiration for making music, that was obviously an audio program that very much focuses on beats and hip hop. So of course it's a no-brainer he was going to make hip hop music. But when we look at 2023 and his album Austin, all of this I'm going to cover in the next bit of the podcast. But when it comes with that album and he's venturing into pop folk music / a kind of acoustic music vibe, that very much corresponds with him having a child and him doing some self-reflection. You know, acoustic music is very stripped back, and I feel like that's where Post Malone was in his life. Like, he was kind of having to start fresh again, which again is going to make more sense once you hear the context of what's to come in his life. And then when you fast forward to 2024 in country, he grew up in Texas when he was 9, from 9 years old onwards, and he was surrounded by country music. So of course that was going to play a part in his influence on his music at some point. And with the year country music's had, it's a no-brainer he would have decided to do that decision in moving to country in this year. Like, now it was the perfect time to do it. So yeah, I don't know, like, is he a culture vulture? I personally don't think so, but I appreciate that I'm also not from the culture that Post Malone misappropriated. So, you know, maybe I can't give like a full enough or valuable enough opinion on this. So anyway, this hate and attachment to the culture vulture label is something that plagues Post Malone from the beginnings of his career in 2015 to, I'd say, probably around 2020. And I'm going to explain how it honestly kind of derailed his whole life in a minute. But for now, just to keep you up to speed with everything, I'm going to quickly fill in the gaps. In 2017, he releases the single Rockstar featuring 21 Savage, which I'd say is probably the quintessential Post Malone song. It's now surpassed 3 billion streams on Spotify, a massive number. I can't even comprehend that. And ultimately, it led to himself and 21 Savage going on a joint headline tour together. Think the Sweat Tour. Think the Charlie and Troye Sivan Sweat Tour, but hip-hop. So we've got 21 Savage and Post Malone. A great lineup, if you ask me. Again, I would say, like, what I mean when I say I think Rockstar is the quintessential Post Malone song, It's probably his most famous song. It's probably the most recognizable Post Malone song, and it really defines his sound. Especially like before he kind of became genre defying, I would say that's the original Post Malone sound. In 2018, he released his sophomore album, Beer Bongs and Bentleys, which ended up breaking the first day streaming records for an album on Spotify, totaling at 78.7 million worldwide streams in one day. That's a hell of a load of people and a hell of a load of streams for 24 hours. But when I was doing some digging, doing some research, I wanted to find out who holds the record for this stat now. And of course, my favourite, it's no other than Taylor Swift with the Torture Poets Department, setting the new record this year, with the Torture Poets Department having 300 million streams in one day. And ironically, Post Malone features on the first song of the album with the song Fortnite. But just as a really quick side note, I don't have, enough time per se to really get into how streaming has changed in the music industry, but I think those stats alone really highlight it. Like 2018, 78.7 million is the 24-hour record. Fast forward to 2024, it's 300 million. I mean, these are just incomprehensible numbers. But anyway, Post's 2018 was also filled with curveballs and freak incidents. The first coming in August, when he found himself caught in a plane crash. Due to pilot errors, the tyres for the wheels, which are used in plane landings, so, quite a key aspect of a plane, they started to explode mid-air, causing the plane to have to make an emergency landing at the nearest airport, which I believe was in New York. Luckily, no one was injured and only the plane suffered considerable damage. But the life-threatening events don't just stop there. If you didn't think that was enough trauma for Post Malone, let alone having like all of this cancel culture going on as well, it doesn't stop there. In literally 2 weeks later after the plane crash, Post's Rolls Royce was left hugely damaged after a collision with another car. His driver ended up swerving into a fence to avoid hitting the car, or, to try and save them all. And it worked. Luckily no one was injured. Just again, the cars were heavily damaged. But the police said it wasn't clear what caused the crash. There was no alcohol or drugs found in either of the party systems. It just seemed to be an unfortunate and, again, mildly traumatizing incident. But what both these situations highlighted was just how hated Post Malone was. Post Malone came back to social media with people on Twitter hoping he would die and praying that he'd be injured after the news broke of the plane crash and the car crash. I think at the time, Post Malone seemed to laugh it all off and kind of brush it under the carpet. But what came to light a couple of years later was that he wasn't coping at all. In fact, he was rapidly spiraling out of control and befriended alcohol as his coping mechanism instead. And this is where Post's story gets really sad, but I think it's a turning point which almost saves him. Like he said it in an interview, but he needed to go through this low point and this alcohol addiction in order to be the man he is now. Fans started to worry and become concerned with Post Malone's health in 2020 when he embarked on his tour for his 2019 #1 album, Hollywood's Bleeding. Again, this album I'd say is the quintessential Post Malone album in a similar way that I said Rockstar featuring 21 Savage was his quintessential song. It was huge, this album. It was massive. I mean, the title alone is just a fantastic album title. Like Hollywood's Bleeding, there's just so much you can get from that as a title. It feels quite poetic. But that's just me, like, loving the words. The actual album, I think, is just very representative of the sound Post Malone brings to the music industry, which, recently I guess we as fans have kind of lost due to the fact he has switched up his genres. But it's that classic fusion of hip-hop, electronic, and rap music. He just has a sound, Post Malone. I would say it's quite similar to The Weeknd, but The Weeknd's a lot more pop. Anyway, after videos of Post Malone stumbling and acting oddly on stage began to circle the internet, the question of is Post Malone okay became a very, very prominent one. Post responded with a statement saying he was not on drugs and he feels the best he's ever felt in his whole life. But in an interview with Howard Stern just 2 years later in 2022, he really bravely admitted that he did in fact have a problem with alcohol, and he had to take time out in an effort to be the kind of person he wanted to be. Something that I found really, really poignant in the interview was when he was describing how rough his lowest point was. He mentioned that he couldn't get off the floor for weeks, and he'd be begging for help from people his mind just conjured up before him that didn't even exist because of the hallucinations. What got me even more, though, is that he didn't seek professional help. He just used his fiancée and the knowledge that they had a child on the way as his guidance for controlling the addiction and letting it subdue. He also points out that the culture vulture trolling was really the cause for the alcoholism. He doesn't directly refer to it as, the root cause, but he does say that he drunk because he was sad. And ultimately, that cancelling, if you want to call it that, is what threw him into that depression in the first place. He also explains that 2020 was his rock bottom. He'd wake up, cry, drink, do his day, cry, drink, and repeat. It's just so sad that I think so many musicians go down this pathway. And I think, it's definitely got better. Like, obviously, mental health's become way more of a conversation nowadays. And a lot of artists, you look at, I'm obviously referring to pop culture, but you look at Arlo Parks and you look at Chapel Roan, and it's like they would cancel their tours to save their mental health. And, artists should do that, but they still receive backlash for it. Like, Chapel's received so much backlash for that. With people bouncing back saying, you decided to be in the public eye, ultimately deal with it. But people, you have to take time off tour so you don't get into the position Post Malone did, where the loneliness and the spiraling out of control can sometimes lead to an addiction that derails your whole life. And I think it's that Post Malone mentioned it was that loneliness that really got him in the first place. And I think what's even more heartbreaking is that, he drank because he was lonely, but ultimately drinking is what furthered that loneliness. It cuts you off from everyone because you're just not yourself, and you're just so out of it, and you're just drowning and drinking in your wallows. But he ends the chat about his addiction on something of a positive, if not a very reflective note. He says, "I don't want people to feel the way I felt, and I know they do. I'm here and I'm on stage, and I just want everyone to feel welcomed and to feel loved." It's honestly, the respect I have for Post Malone has only grown. I really loved, we're going to get onto it again in a minute, but I really loved his pop folk album, Austin. And this, knowing that he'd been through this addiction and dealt with it on his own, only grew my respect. An addiction is so, so, so hard to overcome, especially on your own, because a lot of the time, especially with Post Malone, if you're feeling that sadness and loneliness, you're gonna want to find you're gonna run to your cure, and your habits say that the cure is alcohol. So the fact that he was feeling all those emotions and was strong enough to not do that, and was strong enough to change and be who he wanted to be, I think it's just remarkable. And I think there's also something very touching or heartfelt in that. And I think the way he summed up that interview was just kind of beautiful, to be honest. The fact he looks at every single one of his fans at his shows and feels their struggles and know that they struggle, and know that some of them might even be going through the same thing he's going through, alcohol addiction. I think, the fact that he changed and he got better because he wants to give fans what he felt he lacked, which is that love and that friendship and that companionship. I just think he's a special man, Post Malone, I really do. Anyway, in terms of how he moved on from his addiction career-wise, Post Malone came out with his pop folk album, Austin, as I just mentioned. This album is obviously named after him, which speaks as an ode to the self-reflection he'd done whilst controlling his addiction, as well as taking time out to become a father for his newly born child. This album was great. This album was absolutely fantastic. Obviously, it received very mixed opinions from the public because it was his first genre-hopping album. He went from Post Malone as we know him, as I said, with the quintessential Hollywood Stop Bleeding, to pop folk and a guitar, And it still had the Post Malone sound, don't get me wrong, but it was obviously a very different direction for Post. It worked in my favour fantastically well because he worked with producers who'd worked with Taylor Swift and Lana Del Rey, so, an absolute no-brainer that I adored it. But for his OG fans, I think that's where a lot of people were like, what's happened to Post Malone? Like, he's lost his way, he's lost his sound, that kind of thing. Ultimately, it was Austin that made space, maybe even held space, if you will, for Post Malone to venture and grow even more as an artist, leading him to create his 2024 country album, F to 1 Trillion. Interestingly, in the lead up to this record, he had worked on Beyoncé's seismic album Cowboy Carter 2, which had been her first exploration into the country music scene. And as I mentioned at the top of this episode, or elsewhere in the episode, even in last week's Morgan Wallen's, or, the week before Zach Bryan's, country music this year has just had the most incredible popularity and success. A lot of songs in the charts have followed the kind of folky country vibe. We've got Dash's Austin, Did My Boot Stop Working? We've got that song. We've got Beyonce's Texas Hold'em. We've got Shaboozie's A Bar Song Tipsy. We've got Noah Kahan's Stick Season. Ultimately not really a country song, but it's that folksy, acousticy, guitar-y vibe. You've got Hosier's Too Sweet, a very similar folk. I mean, I don't know if you'd call Hosier folk, but it's that acoustic energy. And yeah, it's a no-brainer that, to be honest, that Post Malone followed where the music scene was going. I think he was just moulding and being flexible with the times. And I really respect him as an artist for that. Again, a lot of people just say, oh, he's just, trying to profit, trying to make money off what's popular. And maybe there is an element of that, but also good on him. Not every rap artist could make a pop folk album and then go on to make a country album. It takes talent to do that. And it takes courage, I think, to ditch what works and to ditch what your fans might like to do what you want to do. So with that being said, it's really no surprise that F to 1 Trillion debuted at number 1 on the charts. It featured all of the best / renowned country artists of our time and of the time a couple decades ago. And it also saw him announcing a stadium tour for 2025. So to conclude, I just think Post Malone is fab. I think he's fab. From taking a shot in the dark by moving to LA to making number 1 albums and receiving relentless Grammy nominations, I think it's remarkable how successful and how increasingly successful he is. As I said, not everyone would be able to bounce back from being cancelled or control a substance addiction on their own and still come out on top. And a nice guy and very perceptive guy who really cares about his fans and his family, but also B, a chart-topping artist who continues to land incredible collaborations. I think he deserves all the flowers he gets, every single one. I would be throwing flowers for him at the end of a performance if I could. And on that note, thank you all so much for listening. I will be back very, very shortly with another episode on another artist. If you want to keep up to date with all things Six Notes of Separation, make sure to follow us at Six Notes Podcast. And we'll be back exploring the link between whoever it is and Post Malone.